and also co-founder of the Niagara Hockey Coaches Seminar, alongside Marie Nystrom and Greg Capillero and Wayne Chapman. This is our 9th webinar that we've done since the beginning of the pandemic. Today is going to be a little bit different format in the sense that the presentation is going to be only about 25 to 30 minutes long, and then a more interactive Q&A. So do encourage anyone who has questions throughout the presentation to type them into the chat or the Q&A. Today's speaker, Jack Han, most recently was with the Toronto Maple Leafs organization in the role of assistant coach with the Marlies, their American League affiliate. What I really like about Jack is that he's had a very divergent path in his career that's taken him a lot of different directions, whether it was writing or analytics or coaching. And so today he's going to present to you on getting out of your own way. It's a really interesting presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and we can get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jack. Really happy that you are here today. So let me just get right into this. I first had the idea to do this presentation when I read this article on Farnham Street, which I'll share at the end of the presentation. But the article was titled "How Not to Be Stupid." I felt like it was a bit of an overly jarring title to use for my presentation. So I'm just going to go with how to get out of your own way. Now, for those of you who aren't aviation buffs like me, what you're seeing on your screen is a Korean Air Boeing 747. It has 4 engines. It was the largest passenger plane in the world at the time. It can carry up to about 450 passengers. There are three people in the cockpit, so pilot, first officer, and navigator, plus anywhere between 8 and 10 flight attendants to serve those 400 passengers. Next slide, please. Yeah, so Korean Air Flight 801. So back in 1997, there was a crash involving that plane that you just saw on a flight from Seoul, South Korea to the island of Guam. There were 254 people aboard, and what happened was on their final approach to Guam, there was some really bad weather over the island. And to compound the issue, one of the navigation beacons leading down to the airport was malfunctioning. So, you know, that brought up a very challenging situation for the 3 people in the cockpit who, you know, I can kind of make a parallel to coaching staff. So, you know, you have your players, you know, in the cabins, which are the passengers, and then you have the coaches up front, who are the captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer. Now, these are some very experienced people. You know, you don't just get to fly a 747 fresh out of flight school. So the captain had 9,000 flight hours and had just received a flight safety award. And notice that, you know, he's very close to that 10,000 hour mastery idea that, you know, Malcolm Gladwell popularized in his books. So, you know, you have a master in the captain spot. The first officer, you know, still 4,000 flight hours, very respectable total. And the flight engineer has 15,000 flight hours. So once again, a very experienced, a very expert person in his role. Next, please. So as I mentioned before, there's heavy rain on the approach to Guam, and the flight crew did what we call instrument landing, which means that they weren't looking outside at all because there was nothing to see. It was dark and it was rainy, and they were using their cockpit equipment and navigational tools to bring a very big plane very safely down on a very small runway. Unfortunately, what happened was that the navigation beacon at the airport was malfunctioning, and the captain either forgot about it or you know, he made a mistake and he locked his navigational system onto an incorrect signal. So that was the equivalent of wanting to go somewhere in your GPS and typing in the wrong address. So obviously, if you follow the GPS, you're not going to end up where you want to be going. So then the plane begins its descent, and then the first officer and the flight engineer noticed that something was off. You know, all the landmarks that they were supposed to be passing, or the indications that they were getting from their instruments, didn't really line up with what was supposed to be happening. So on several occasions, they tried to get the captain's attention. So, you know, in a hockey situation, it could be, you know, you're not putting in the correct line or the correct D pair in the zone faceoff. Or maybe there's 2 minutes left in the game, you're down by 1, and you got to be thinking about pulling the goalie. So you have these assistant coaches essentially trying to get the head coach's attention, but the head coach was overly absorbed in what he was doing. And, you know, because of his experience, his seniority, and just the control he had over the overall situation, never really paid attention to what his staff was telling him. And unfortunately, the aircraft crashed into the side of a hill, which it never should have, because if you follow the runway, the coast would have been clear, but they were about 5 kilometers off course and crashed into the side of a mountain. All 3 people in the cockpit died, and about 3/4 of the passengers in the cabin died. So that was a terrible outcome, and a major impetus for the commercial airline industry to learn and to change because of this incident. So if you read what the National Transport Safety Board found, is that first of all, the captain made a mistake. Second of all, his first officer and his flight engineer were unable to convince him that he had made a mistake. In addition to the captain's fatigue and career errors, inadequate flight crew training, so they didn't have any coping strategies to recover from a mistake when the most senior person erred. So all this together, 229 people died because of it. And this incident is an example of something called controlled flight into terrain. So what that means is there was nothing wrong with the plane. The plane could have landed safely, but because of pilot error, because of human error, the plane crashed. Over 9,000 people have died from such incidents since the 1950s. Now, I picked this specific story because, you know, when a pilot makes a mistake, he dies, his staff dies, and his passengers die. When a hockey coach makes such a mistake, you know, really the worst thing that can happen is that you lose 1 game, or you let in 1 goal, or you don't score 1 goal. So the stakes are much lower for us, which is good because, you know, we don't want to have, you know, that kind of negative consequence associated to what we're doing. But on the other hand, it's not so good because we're way less motivated to learn from our mistakes, or even to recognize our mistakes and then to be better. So coming back to the How Not to Be Stupid article that I read, there were 7 key factors which leads to someone being stupid. So a smart person, a qualified person, doing something that in hindsight is not a good idea. So the first one is be outside of your circle of competence. So if you go back to the Korean Air incident, you know, it was at night, there was weather, and the navigation beacon was broken. So that puts you in a situation where, as a well-trained pilot, you might not be outside of your competence necessarily, but you are being tested. The second part is to be stressed. So the landing is the most stressful part of the flight, and most crashes happen around the time when the flight's supposed to land. To be in a hurry. So, you know, it was late at night, there was weather, the captain wants to put the plane down on his first try. He doesn't want to be going around, right? Fuel might be running low. So he was in a hurry to get his plane down and get a good night's sleep. 4, to be fixated on an outcome. So once again, you want to land that plane. You want to win a hockey game. 5, to be overloaded with information. So if you go back to that opening slide, there are hundreds or even thousands of dials and switches and instruments inside a cockpit. There's a lot of information going on. Same thing when you're coaching. There's, you know, you have about 20 players, 5 of them are on the ice plus the goalie. The other team has about 20 players, just 5 of them on the ice. There's a refs, there's a crowd, there are bad calls, there's noise. So all of that information is going to affect how good you are at processing and making decisions. 6, be unaware of group dynamics. Maybe you're in conflict with your player. Maybe you don't get along with your assistant coach. Maybe you really want to beat the guy on the other bench. 7, to be or be around an expert. So, if you play at a high enough level, or if you coach at a high enough level, you are an expert. So you have an ego to protect. And that's something that's very important to keep in mind. So once again, acting alone, any of these are powerful enough, but together they dramatically increase the odds you are unaware that you've been cognitively compromised. So, when you're cognitively compromised, you do stupid things. And if we go back throughout this list, there's probably 5 or 6 of these at play, which caused a perfectly fine airplane with perfectly qualified staff to crash into the side of a mountain. So just some quick examples on the 7 factors that we talked about. So we know that Mike Sullivan is an incredibly successful coach. He's won 2 Stanley Cups with the Pittsburgh Penguins, but you might not remember him as a rookie head coach with the Boston Bruins around about 2004. And I remember this vividly because I was a Habs fan growing up, and I remember that famous first round upset that the Habs had over Sullivan's Bruins in 2004. It was a 7-game series, and I think the Habs won either 1-0 or 2-0 in game 7. But the fact of the matter is the Bruins could have closed it out. They were up 3-2 when they didn't. And I think the following year, Sullivan was fired, and he didn't have a head coaching job in the NHL until about a decade later. And, all the things that he's learned in the meantime and all the things that he did to increase his circle of competence, no doubt made him a better coach his second time around. Next. Stress. So on the photo here, you see a guy who doesn't look super stressed right now. That's Peter Smith, who I worked with for many years, and at McGill University continues to be a great friend of mine. And when I was his video coach / statistical analyst, what I figured out was a big part of my job actually was not to provide him with information, but rather to manage his stress level. So by being prepared, or by being timely with my reports, and maybe sometimes going the extra mile, or doing a little bit more, what that allowed Peter to do is to feel less stressed out, to get a better night's sleep, and to be more relaxed, and to be more competent when making decisions, which impacted our team. So that was really my prime priority when it came to, anytime there was a big game or the playoffs or national championships, was just to be on top of my stuff so that, Peter's stress level would be lower. And, we had some tremendously successful seasons. And I think a lot of it was due to the fact that we did a very good job managing his stress level, and therefore the player's stress level when it came to crunch time. Next, please. Rushing. So I found out that you can learn a lot by talking to bus drivers. And the most interesting story I've heard from one of our bus drivers is the time that he drove a coach who was working at the AHL level but is now an NHL coach. And they were on a road trip, and it was snowing heavily. And the road conditions were very bad, and visibility was very low. But for some reason, this coach was in a hurry, and he was in the front of the bus, standing next to the driver and telling him to go faster and faster in the snow, despite the fact that the driver really felt uncomfortable going at a certain speed in those conditions. Now, we know what happened in Swift Current. We know what happened in Humboldt. And wouldn't it be such a shame if just because you want to get to the rink about 20 minutes earlier that, you cause an accident by making somebody rush when they shouldn't be rushing? And I leave that with you because, in our line of work, the worst thing that can happen is that we get to the rink late. And, whether the other team starts with a power play, or they start with a goal, or, we even forfeit the game, is that really worth putting everybody's lives on the line? So that's a very dramatic example, but there's probably dozens and dozens of ways which, as a coach, we're rushing on a practice day or on a game day. So it's all about avoiding those kind of situations and knowing to take a breath, relax, and step back when you do notice these situations come up. Next, please. Fixation on outcomes. So this photo here is the Soviet national team. The coach that we see here is Viktor Tikhonov. Now, before I start, I like to point out that Anatoly Tarasov is widely known as the father of Soviet hockey, and him and Viktor Tikhonov are definitely not the same person. So I hope you never confuse Tarasov and Tikhonov. I know that they're both Russians and they both have a last name starting with the letter T, but they were very different people with very different approaches. So the example I want to bring your attention to is that miracle on ice game at the 1980 Winter Olympics. Coming into the game, the Soviets had won 2 Olympic medals. They had destroyed the U.S. team, I think 10-3 at Madison Square Garden the week before they played. They were riding like a 3-month undefeated streak. So not that they were overconfident, but I think they were poorly equipped mentally to deal with the U.S. team when they started showing pushback. And what happened was, with about 2 seconds left in the first period, the score was 2-1 for the Soviet Union. And then there was this kind of very harmless play throughout the neutral zone. There was a loose puck that got dumped out of the U.S. zone, at the feet of 2 Soviet defensemen. And what happened was Mark Johnson, who's one of the smartest and most skilled players in the U.S. team, recognized that, there is time to make a play. So he sprinted past those 2 guys and went in all alone against Vladislav Tretiak, who was back then the best goalie in the world. Tretiak actually made the first save, but then the rebound came right back out to Johnson, who buried the rebound. So there was either 1 second or no time left on the clock, depending on who you ask. And Tikhonov made a decision that, in hindsight, was a very poor one. So what he did was he pulled Tretiak. Remember, now we're tied 2-2 in the first period. So he pulls Tretiak and puts in backup by the name of Mishkin, who's a good goalie, but definitely not the best in the world. And the U.S. ended up winning 4-3. So, if you look at this objectively with the benefit of hindsight, you would think that, okay, you are the best hockey team in the world, with the best goalie in the world. You're tied 2-2 going into the first intermission. You really should not be worried at all. Okay, you have the horses to win out here. But what happened was, I think Tikhonov snapped. He was mentally unprepared. He was maybe a little bit embarrassed, maybe very angry. He was fixated on the fact that his team hadn't lost in a while and that they shouldn't be losing against the U.S. And he made a poor decision. And then in the dying minutes of the game, they were trailing 4-3. And then he made another poor decision by never taking a timeout or pulling his goalie. Because, in the words of Slava Fetisov, who was one of the best players on that team and, Stanley Cup winner, he just said the coach went crazy. Tikhonov was so obsessed and so fixated that he made some rookie mistakes. Next, please. So information overload. So what you see here is what a typical NHL or AHL level video coach sees during a game. So there's probably at least 3 screens. When I worked with the Marlies, I was in the video room during games, and this looks a lot like what I saw. And there's just so much information that you have access to. You have different feeds. You have the real-time statistics or analytics rolling in. You have your assistant coach on the radio telling you to clip certain plays or to ask for your opinion on a replay, etc. So, on the one hand, you are probably the person with the best vantage point in the entire rink because you have so many feeds. You're not standing on the bench. You have a high TV angle. You hear what's going on. You know what's going on. So really, you're the guy who probably is able to make the best decision. But on the other hand, if you ask me, who scored the last goal, I couldn't even tell you because I was so overwhelmed with all these feeds and clipping plays on my laptop and talking to my assistant, so on and so forth, that, you know, it's almost like you're blind to certain things that are happening. Like I couldn't tell you who's just scored. Sometimes I couldn't even tell you how much time or what the score was, like, because I was just so, you know, immersed in the moment. And I see that somebody in chat just wrote something about, what was it? Let's see. Yeah, checklist. So that person mentioned that pilots have checklists so that they don't forget important steps. Well, sometimes you are so overwhelmed with information that you forget to check the checklist. And that's a very real thing. And that's what information overload can do to you. So after the fact, you get in trouble because your supervisor comes in and says, well, you have a checklist. Why didn't you check it? Well, it's because you were so busy that you forgot that you had a checklist. Next, please. Group dynamics. Obviously, hockey is a team sport, and I would argue that coaching hockey is also a team sport. And on this point, I kind of envy players because obviously, you know, they get to have fun to go on the ice and score goals and whatnot, but they also, you know, they're sort of allowed to fight. You know, they can fight with the opponents. They get 5 minutes or tossed from the game, whatever. They can even fight with their teammates in practice. However, if you're a hockey coach, it's a really bad look to be fighting with your assistants. So generally speaking, the fighting becomes conversations or arguments, or, you know, it can be totally unspoken, which is probably the worst thing, because then you're no longer on the same page and maybe you're pulling different directions, and that affects everything that you try to do. So, you know, in that Korean Air incident, the captain was so self-absorbed that he gave no time of day to his very experienced first officer and flight engineer. And that group dynamic is, to some degrees, it's influenced by society, because in Korea, it's very hierarchical. So, you know, your boss is the man, and you have to listen to him, and you have to do what he says, even when it costs you your life and his life, for that matter. So very important to be aware of that. Next, please. So the final point is expert presence. So at the NHL level, you have players on the bench who are experts. They're the best in the world at what they do. And then the coaches on the bench are also experts. They're the best in the world at what they do. So obviously that's a good thing, because you have good people, competent people, but it's also a bad thing because in those kind of situations, you get very self-aware and you try to protect yourself at all costs. You know, NHL players, a lot of them don't feel like they have freedom to make plays, because if they work out, then okay, you know, you score and your team is leading, and great. But if it doesn't work out, you come back to the bench, you get yelled at, you get sworn at, you get benched, maybe eventually you get traded. So, you know, it's, you know, we are logical beings, but we're also highly emotive beings. So if you're living in fear of being punished, then most likely you're not going to do your best work. And I think that's something that that's very important as you progress to the levels of, you know, AHL, NHL hockey, or international competition, and so on and so forth. Because, you know, if you're a parent volunteering to coach Pee-wees or Bantams, you know that you're not an expert, and you know that your players are not experts. So, you know, you're probably more forgiving of mistakes on their end, and hopefully you are more forgiving of mistakes on your own end. But as the stakes increase, this expert problem becomes something that you have to be aware of, and that you have to consciously and actively manage. Next, please. So here's what I propose for getting out of your own way, or AKA not being stupid. So first of all, take a timeout. You know, if you're trailing late in the game, you should be taking your timeout to rest your players, but also to think. So anytime that you see a problem kind of developing, take a timeout. You know, go somewhere by yourself, take a deep breath, chill out, take 2 minutes, and think. So first of all, what don't I understand here? Are you outside of your scope of competence? Chances are there's something that you're missing. and chances are there's someone around you who can help you, whether it's an assistant, whether it's your video coach, whether it's your trainer, whether it's maybe your player. If you're around good people, then someone is going to be able to help you. How am I feeling? Am I tired? Am I hungry? Am I scared? Am I angry? Maybe it's as simple as, your blood sugar has dipped and you should eat something. Because if you don't eat something, you're going to yell at the ref and get a minor penalty, or yell at a player and have that player shut down on you for the rest of the game. Am I in a hurry? So a very good technique to address being in a hurry is to separate your tasks, preferably on paper, into the 4 quadrants. So you have on one axis, is it urgent or is it not urgent? And the other axis, is it important and is it not important? So the things which are urgent and important require your immediate attention. You should probably start with those. The tasks which are urgent but not important, you should probably delegate. So once again, can your assistant do it? Can your video coach do it? Can a trainer do it? Can your equipment manager do it? Anybody but you, because we know that it has to be done, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done by you. Is it important and not urgent? Then this is probably something that you can put off. Maybe, your wife or your husband has a medical procedure the following day. Well, there's no use stressing about it now, right? Maybe you can help that person to be prepared or whatever, but there's nothing you can do about it now, so it's not really an urgent thing, so just park it. Is it not urgent and not important? Well, then either have somebody else do it or leave it undone if you really are in a time crunch. The next thing is, so what if it doesn't happen? So if you think back to Tikhonov, it's 2-2 after one period. The team's in good shape. So what if we didn't win the first period? We got 2 more to play, and I'm coaching the best team in the world with the best goalie in the world. I should just trust them. And that was something that a lot of players didn't like about Tikhonov. He was very authoritarian. He didn't trust his players. If you ever watch like the movie The Russian Five, he had the 5 best players and the best 5-man unit on the planet back then. And, he let them do their own thing, but for his other players, he didn't have that degree of trust. So, it's very cliche to say trust the process, but that's what you got to do. In terms of, trying to manage information overload. So you got to ask yourself, what's the essential here? So one example, I was at a coaching conference, and one of the questions that someone posed was, how do you stop Ovechkin on the Washington power play? So obviously it's an iconic play where Ovi gets fed on his left flank and takes a one-timer and it goes in the net. So how do you stop it, right? Because no matter what the best coaches and the best goalies and the best PKs in the world do, it seems like he just keeps scoring from that spot. So then you have to use the concept of first principles. So first of all, Ovi can't score on the power play if you don't take penalties. Second of all, Ovi can't score on the power play if you don't let Washington get into the zone. Third of all, Ovi can't score on the power play if you don't let Washington set up. And fourth of all, and probably the least of your priorities, Ovi can't score on the power play if either your goalie or your D-man gets a body part in front of that puck. But you have to think things through that priority. So none of the things matter if you're taking 10 penalties against Washington. They're going to find a way to score. Whereas if you take 0 penalties, they're definitely not going to score. And this happened last season when we were game planning against a team with a very strong shooter, such as Ovi. In fact, that player was a left-hander, so he set up on the opposite side. But otherwise, the team we played against ran a 1-3-1 exactly like Washington. So our D coach was asking me, what I would do to shut them down, and I said, well, if you look at Ovi, if you look at such a dominant shooter, they can only one-time the puck if they didn't have the puck to begin with. So what would happen if we forced them to have the puck on the entry? If we forced their power play breakout toward the shooting threat so that this player, who's a dangerous shooter, would have to play to his weakness and try to carry the puck in. And if you watch Washington's power play, what happens is whenever Ovi has to enter on the left side of the ice, he's going to rim it hard to Backstrom on the right side. So what happens is you get the puck into Ovi's hand, he's going to rim it, and then you jump on Backstrom on the other side. And that was exactly the kind of play that we used against this team. And they hardly had a shot. They couldn't set up. They couldn't shoot. They definitely didn't have any scoring chance against us, and we win the game. Okay, so the other thing is group dynamics. Am I listening to what they're saying? So in the case of Korean Air, the captain definitely wasn't listening to his flight crew, even though they kept repeating that there was something that merited his attention. He just blocked them out, and then they crashed. And the final thing is to overcome the expert problem is to visualize what a sixth grader would say or what a sixth grader would ask. Now, if you were around for Darryl Belfry's presentation earlier this week, he talked about co-learning as the ultimate manifestation of coaching, where both the coach and the player they're conversing, they're exchanging ideas, they're trying to think things through together. And ultimately, this is the same idea. You know, if you pretend that you were a sixth grader and you encouraged your players or your staff to ask questions that a sixth grader would, you will probably hit on some good ideas and also, you know, take the ego aspect out of play, because sixth graders aren't experts in anything. Next, please. So just to kind of wrap this up, for those of you who know about G.I. Joe, this is kind of I want to wrap it up on a lighter note. So basically the saying is knowing is half the battle. So as long as you know about these 7 pitfalls, then you will be in a better spot to find solutions and address them and make sure that you're not stupid the next time you coach. That's it. Thank you.
So Jack, great presentation. There are some questions coming in. The first one that I got, it was actually texted to me, that a certain level of not being stupid requires self-awareness, which you could talk a little bit about. As a head coach, you know, what can a head coach do to develop self-awareness if they're not recognizing these things? And then as an assistant coach, dealing with someone who necessarily maybe can't get out of their own way. I mean, do you have any advice for that?
So one practice that I've heard of, which is being used in the airline industry, is whenever there's an emergency situation, the co-pilot takes over the controls of the plane and the captain acts as a cross-checker. So the way that we can use this in hockey is, for head coaches, you should be delegating more and then acting as a second opinion or a cross-checker for your assistants. And if you look at what the best head coaches do, they empower their people, and then they use their experience to kind of be a safety valve. And I think that's the best way to first of all make better decisions, but second of all to develop good people and have them stick around.
In regards to group dynamics and listening to what your players are saying, can you give some examples of how players may tell the coach that things aren't working without necessarily verbally telling? Like, are there cues maybe that a coach could look for in that group dynamic?
That one's hard to say because I'm not like an education specialist or any, you know, a body language specialist. But what I would say is I would encourage you to ask these 2 questions to your players after a shift. So first of all is, what did you see out there? You know, you could be referencing to a specific player or just in general, right? The second is, what did it feel like out there? So what happens is that asking these questions is a relatively non-invasive way to get a pulse of what your player's feeling. And it takes the ego or the expert problem off the table because you're honestly just trying to find out what their perspective is. And this is something that I used to do when I look at video with players is, you know, before I tell them what they were supposed to do, first I need to take a temperature and say, what did you see there, just so that I know what they saw, because they can't make the correct play if they can't see it, and they can't do the correct things if they're not feeling it. So first of all, you got to make sure that you're on the same page about that, and then secondly, come in with the teaching.
I'm not sure you can necessarily speak to this, but coming from a situation where there were basically all experts, you kind of alluded to this, that a head coach and an assistant coach at the National Hockey League level are experts, and their players are all experts. How would you diffuse a situation where maybe people aren't getting out of each other's way, where there may be a difference of opinion and everyone is an expert?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say about that is, so the coaches are experts, the players are experts, but so are the guys on the other side. And if you can't get out of your own way, or if you can't get out of if you can't get out of each other's way, then when you go up against another team of experts, you might lose. And it's as simple as that. There's no point in being smart or being qualified or being knowledgeable if the other side's knowledge cancels you out and you're not able to find solutions. Then you lose. There's no other way about it.
Another question just came in. How do you deal then with a coach that thinks that they're an expert when clearly they are not?
Consider about finding a different coach.
If you can't change your people, then change your people.
Mm-hmm.
There was a mention in the chat earlier that was kind of alluded to pilots having checklists for procedures. What would a coaching checklist look like to get through an emergency? I mean, I know you kind of gave some advice at the end of your presentation in terms of taking a timeout, but what are some common situations that you think would be considered an emergency in hockey, and what would a checklist look like for that?
I mean, hockey is a game of emergencies, right? Like if you're giving up a scoring chance, or if you squander a scoring chance, or if you give up an odd man rush, or you have a D-zone face-off and your players are tired, or somebody gets hurt, or somebody takes a penalty. Like there's probably hundreds that happen in a given game. So I think the first step is to recognize what kind of emotions these elicit in you, and then taking a breath helps in every case, I think. But figure out like what specific things trigger you, and then work on those triggers.
And before we wrap up, I know you have a book listed here for more information on this topic. You have a book that's coming out, but are there any other books that you would recommend maybe some aspiring coaches should read, some recommended reading? I mean, I know there's lots of avid readers on this call, and in coaching in general. What are some of your favorites? What would you recommend? And then
so the articles and the book that I have, I think, are good starting points because they reference a lot of non-hockey examples. I think you are limiting yourself if you're only reading hockey books or even sports books, because in other industries, as we found out today, bad decisions have much more severe consequences. And because the consequences are severe, the motivation to learn is much higher. So I think you should be learning from other industries, such as the airline industry or the medical industry, or the military, or anytime that mistakes result in lives being lost, I think there's a very strong motivation to learn, and I think you should seek out reads in those areas.
That's fantastic advice. As I mentioned at the top, your career has been very divergent, and I'm sure it will continue to be. And I think when you draw from those experiences in different areas of your life, I think they become very applicable if you can make those connections. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And everyone on the call, this recording will be made available, but also a post-event email will go out with Jack's information if you'd like to continue some dialogue with him. And definitely encourage any of you to go and pre-order his book. Our next will be on Wednesday with Andrew Dovey, the assistant coach, University of Toronto, men's hockey, on plan, perform, practice, and prepare. So kind of walking through an entire week with their program and what that looks like. So Jack, really appreciate it. As I said, if anyone wants to contact you directly, we'll include that info, and hope everyone's staying safe out there.